evidence for NT5103, we're going to be working on how to chart the evidence for textual problems in the Greek New Testament. And the problem we're going to come back working with is this one in Ephesians 1:1, the omission of NFSO. The evidence for the readings in Nestle Aland are given, of course, in the apparatus. There's two of them, the omission and the insertion. This is an example problem that we'll be looking at in our trying to understand the text critical process. For the TC paper, we're going to be working with Ephesians 2:21, pasa oikotomai, with the insertion in some manuscripts and the omission in others. But for the problem we'll be discussing immediately following the break, we'll be working with this one in Ephesians 1:1. So what we want to do is learn how to chart the manuscript evidence for a text critical problem. In the course files section, I know there's a lot of them here, but one of the more important of the files that you will find is called Greek Manuscripts for Ephesians, NA28. It's this one here towards the bottom of the files section for 103. And the file looks like this. It has 4 columns, gives you the name of the manuscript, the date, the manuscript's contents, as well as its text type. Now, text type is a way of describing which textual stream this particular manuscript you're looking at comes from. There's 3 of them, major ones anyway: Alexandrian, Byzantine, and Western. And for the first phase of our trying to solve a text critical problem, to get a handle on where each reading is and when, we need to chart the manuscript evidence. Now, this handout for manuscripts for Ephesians will tell you the text type affinity for each of the witnesses, only for Ephesians. The article in Scott McKnight's book by Michael Holmes on text criticism is the place where you'll go for text critical information for manuscripts throughout the New Testament. Now, what we need actually to chart the manuscript evidence is a Word document with a table in it for each reading. For instance, if your text critical problem has 2 readings, you will create a table that looks like this for each one of the readings. Let's have a look at what we mean by reading. Of course, there's the reading in the text, and then there's the reading that is the variant reading. The reading in the text is supported by these manuscripts. The variant reading, which in the case of Ephesians 1:1 is the omission, is supported by these manuscripts. And some patristic testimony. So we start by writing our readings. And so we might say that reading number 1 is NFSO. And then reading number 2 would be omit. Now let's consider perhaps another possibility for a different problem. Some text critical problems have, of course, more than 2 readings. If there's only 1 reading in all the manuscripts, there's no text critical problem. But let's take for instance, further back, this problem, tois usen. Notice that there is a corner out pattern next to tois, which tells us in some of the manuscripts we have a different word here or different words here. In some of the witnesses we have the words pas and tois. P46 omits this word tois altogether, whereas the manuscripts that support tois appear here. So for this problem, tois, there would be 3 readings. So you would need a table for each one of the readings. But for our purposes, in our text critical problem, we have only the 2 readings. Might be a good idea to have a title above this so that we can work with it. Now, what I like to do when I'm working on one of these tables is just to paste in the manuscript evidence in along with the reading so that I can just work with the table as it is. We just copy this text critical information, the manuscript evidence, and we paste it in the appropriate slot. You can do this in Word or in your favorite text editor. And so our omit manuscripts appear here. So we have to consult the manuscript list for Ephesians to put these in their appropriate spots. Let's take, for instance, P46. Now, P46 is listed as around AD 200, and it's given an Alexandrian text type. So in my table, I'm going to take P46 and put it in the papyrus row under the column of Alexandrian, and then it's about AD 200, so let's say 3rd century. Now I'm going to use Roman numerals to designate the centuries just in my table, not in the paper, but just in my table, so that I won't make the mistake of thinking that an Arabic numeral is a date. I don't want to confuse them with the manuscript numbers. So let's take Codex Sinaiticus, Aleph and B, and we put those in the majuscules row under Alexandrian, because that's where the manuscript list puts them. Now, any of the manuscripts that you do not find in any of your lists should be put in the other column. So manuscript 6 belongs in the other column for minuscules. Now there's 2 ways I can get the date for these manuscripts. One is to simply memorize them. Codex Sinaiticus is 4th century and Codex Vaticanus is 4th century as well. Well, this makes it 3. There's 3 ways. If you know the date already, you put it in. If you don't know the date, there's 2 ways to get it. One is, again, to use our manuscript list. Manuscript 6 is a 13th century manuscript. Contains all of Ephesians, and its text type is other. 1739, which we're going to see again, is a 10th century manuscript, and it is Alexandrian. So I put 1739 here with an X next to it for 10th century. And there we have all of the manuscript evidence for the omission. Of course, we need to repeat that process for the other side. And what we begin to notice here, of course, is we have, in favor of the omission, we have Aleph star and B star. But notice for reading number 1, the inclusion of NFSO, we have Aleph 2 and B2. Those superscript numbers next to manuscripts of the majuscule variety indicate that those were correctors. So these are the second in both of these situations with Codex Aleph and Codex B. Both of these are the second corrector. Now you might think, well, they belong in the Alexandrian column, but they don't. They belong in the other column. They're still majuscules, of course, but the reason we put them in the other column is that we don't know what text type each of these correctors used when they so-called corrected the manuscript. We call them correctors, even though in some instances correctors could be also called corruptors. Now for Aleph 2 and B2, there's a place we can go to discover the dates for those correctors. In the table of contents for the critical apparatus to the 28th edition, we can go to this section titled Presentation of Variant Readings and Witnesses. This appears in the print edition of Nestle on page 58 and following. The important thing to note here, as far as the correctors is concerned, is at the bottom of page 58 and going on to 59. 1, 2, 3 identifies a correction, 1 or a 2 or a 3, and it identifies a correction made by the first, second, or third corrector. And if this is used with the majuscules, Aleph, B, C, and D, these identify groups of correctors. So this is where I'm looking for the date for these particular correctors. And I see that Aleph 2 dates around the 7th century. And I also see that B2 dates around the 7th century as well. So that's the date I'm going to put in my text critical chart. Now we have to repeat the process for all of the other witnesses that we see along here. So I've repeated the process of putting all of these witnesses into their appropriate columns and rows according to what their manuscript type is and what their text type is, along with their dates. Now, as to the versions that appear at the end of this list for reading number 1, I've put them on my chart for the sake of completeness, but we won't be trying to deal with any of the versional or the patristic evidence for our purposes. But there is one thing that still remains. It's this Gothic M. When we see the Gothic M, we put it in the minuscules category and we assign it a date. The date we assign to it is the 9th through the 16th century. And Gothic M represents a whole bunch of minuscule manuscripts for us with NA28. Now that we have our text critical evidence charts for each reading, we're now in a position to begin evaluating that evidence. And that's what we're going to talk about the next time we meet.